this little violet plant peeking through these cracks in the concrete. And what I'm going to ask for you to write in is a one-word experience that you have looking at this. And Anna, I'm going to ask you if you would be so kind as to read me just some of these words that come up in response to this slide, to this photo.
Of course. So let me just check in with Sid to see if we can open up the Q&A. So that folks can put in their questions or their responses rather.
I appreciate the little hearts and the little thumbs up. Very nice.
There we go. We're flowing now. All right. We've got new life, hope, lots of hope, resilience, survival, thrive, beauty, breakthrough, appreciation, determination, possibility.
Thank you. If anything else sort of jumps up at you, feel free to interrupt me.
Solitude. Let me throw solitude in there because that looks different.
Important. Okay. So this is sort of photo number one to really convey something about AEDP's orientation, which is about our making clinical decision points. So I appreciate, yes, there's solitude and resilience and persistence and tenacity and hope and survival. I think these are some of the key terms that came up, possibility. So what I want you to really think about is that when we're dealing with our patients, when we're dealing with trauma, when we're dealing with emotional suffering, and somebody comes before us, this picture sort of conveys, there are three choices. We can go and focus on this huge expanse of concrete, thick, hard, blocking off, access to soil and fertility and life, right? The stuckness, the layers and layers of protection and defense that are on top of it. So that's one place to focus. The second place we can focus is that we can focus on the brokenness. We can focus on the cracks, on what happens when those protections start to fall apart and stuff starts to not be kept under wraps. Or we can focus on this brave little plant, brave little violet, that against all odds, out of tenacity and resilience, somehow is managing to peek through and burst through hope, tenacity, resilience, survival, and thriving, right? So all three are present in the same person. All three are important. However, one of the things that we're going to look at is that in AEDP, when clinically indicated, and this is going to be a sort of big qualifier, it's always complex in any one situations, but as a rule, in AEDP, when we have choice between focusing on the stuckness and its consequences for the person, or focusing on the brokenness and what's making them feel out of control, or focusing on this little thing that against all odds allows them to thrive in at least a tiny little corner of their being or of their life, we're going to lead with focusing on this little violet. And it always makes me happy that they're accompanied, right? It's one plant, but two flowers. Okay. The next photo Again, I ask you for your one-word associations, just what's in your heart or in your gut, or what comes up for you just when you look at it.
Okay, we've got love, sharing, connection, acceptance, support.
And let me just ask what you feel, not just what the picture connotes, what feelings it evokes in you. I'm going to make this interactive no matter what.
I love it. Safe, warmth, stronger, comfort, joy, fear, sadness. Oh my goodness, so many great responses. Okay, courage, companion, connection.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Mm.
You and I am imagining your faces as we are managing to have a dialogue. So this is the second aspect of AEDP that is really in the title of the book that came out in 2021, which is Undoing Aloneness and the Transformation of Suffering into Flourishing. So we're going to focus particularly, since our workshop today is on relational work and working to heal relational wounds. Somebody said in response to the violet picture, solitude. And I'm going to transform that into aloneness. And we're going to talk a lot about aloneness and undoing aloneness and what happens when we feel accompanied as we undertake this work. And your one-word associations said so much of this: connection, warmth, courage, joy, love. There were all those terms. And I also appreciated that some of you sort of put forth sadness and fear, because indeed, there are two aspects of that, and that's going to be sort of when we get more into like the substance of how we work with relational trauma. When we feel safer, emotions that were too scary to feel alone come to the fore. So fear and sadness also have this opportunity to come forth, not as reactions to the accompaniment, but because of the accompaniment, something that can finally be risked to be felt. And last, and we're also going to talk about this is preview of coming attractions. Indeed, when people have had relational wounding, when people have had relational trauma, when their relationships, have been really the source of their hurt, then much as accompaniment and connection and relationality is wished for, it also carries this other charge that we want it, but we're also scared of it. So again, I very much appreciate all that came forth. And now just a couple more pictures that here, and it is this picture that is on the title page of my slides, connotes protection and, sort of captures the essence of attachment, in that the being that is the one perceived, or in actuality, bigger and stronger. Bowlby said that the attachment figure is somebody who is perceived as being older and wiser. The attachment figure is watching out for what's happening, and the child can feel safe and can sleep. A couple of other sort of right brain things before we get to some of the content. the other aspect of what we're trying to communicate is this model. The model of the attachment figure. Much as I said in response to the hands together, you're not alone. And the people who said not just joy and love and connection, but also fear and sadness, is that when we feel safe and held and accompanied and not alone, then the difficult emotions that we have to contend with can really come to the fore, and they can be expressed and dealt with. And similarly, just the sense of connection and attunement. These are all these different aspects, the focus on resilience, the focus on, the tiny little shoot of hope and resilience, and against all odds, not just surviving, but flowering. And the capacity to have these moments of attunement give us the capacity to do the hard work that is ahead of us. So the next, let's say, take two on what is AEDP. This is a complex model. And, we have a day, which right now seems luxurious. And I'm sure that in the 2/3 into it, I'm going to feel, oh my God, we need so much more time. But this is the organization of my presentation for today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what is AEDP to get us all on the same page. And then I am going to talk about 7 fundamental aspects of the model, and then very specifically applying them to attachment work to transform attachment trauma or to heal relational wounds, 5 aspects. And I think that's going to stand us in very, very good stead for the rest of the day and the videos that I'm going to share with you. So the first is going to be a first AEDP session, which I call attachment from the get-go. And just what I want to front load is that all of these videos that I am going to share with you are actual clinical sessions with actual patients. They're not actors and people, we're not reading a script. These are actual clinical sessions, though they're demo sessions, because they all come from my work with the APA, with the American Psychological Association. Okay. So what we're going to try to do today in one day, though we're very much focusing on the relational aspect, the introductory launching course that I teach is a 5-day AEDP immersion course, where over 5 days we go into all different aspects of the model. We look at videotapes, we do some experiential practices, and so on and so forth. And so at the end of one of my recent immersion courses, I think it was in last year, in the fall, what I asked the group is to sort of create a definition of AEDP. And this is in one sentence. And this is what the group came up with. And it's a long sentence, but it is one sentence. And each of the terms, which I'm going to read to you from this slide, each of these terms, we can just stop and really unfold and develop. And in fact, I will with some of them, but this is a way of putting them together. And there is one more phrase which I will add, which is not there, which is very important. So AEDP is a healing-oriented, mind-body, experiential therapy that puts positive neuroplasticity in clinical action in an embodied, boldly relational context in order to treat and transform trauma and attachment trauma. And the phrase that I would add, that's still within one sentence, and promote flourishing. So each of these terms, healing-oriented, mind-body, experiential, putting positive neuroplasticity in clinical action, embodied, boldly relational, treating and transforming trauma, treating and transforming relational trauma, and promoting flourishing. That's really the comprehensive definition of AEDP. And each of these elements we will at least touch on today. This is also AEDP. These are some of my colleagues in the AEDP world, other faculty members and other members and presenters of the AEDP community that if you come into our community, you will meet. And these are some of the disciplines and approaches that AEDP either draws on or resonates with or is in dialogue with. Positive neuroplasticity, affective neuroscience, strong foundations in attachment theory and research and in developmental studies of caregiver-child interactions. A note about that, so much of the work of the people working in the area of the caregiver-child interaction, Ed Tronick, Beatrice Beebe, Dan Stern, Colwyn Trevarthen, so many of those folks really do moment-to-moment tracking of videos that they take of the interactions between the caregiver and the child. And there's such a tremendous congruence between the fact that they do their studies from videotape and these moment-to-moment, thinly sliced interactions. And that's in fact what we do. We videotape our work, we teach from videotape, we supervise from videotape. And the fact that we can study it and really track it moment to moment, both in real time when we're doing the work, but also when we're studying it and trying and understanding it. It's a huge congruence and parallel. So interpersonal neurobiology, emotion theory, transformational studies, somatically based trauma studies, and a strong foundation in relational psychoanalysis and psychodynamic psychotherapy, which is my original training a million years ago. Okay. In addition, I am very happy to say that at this point, AEDP is empirically supported. In 2020 and 2022, we published 2 big studies showing the effectiveness of AEDP. It's a transdiagnostic study, showed the effectiveness of AEDP. We have a 16-session accelerated model as well. So that's what we studied in the research. And in 2022, we studied and showed that people maintain their therapeutic gains at 1-year follow-up, post-therapy, without therapy. So whatever gains they had made, they were maintained at 6 months and 12 months later. What our research found is that AEDP is effective in reducing a variety of psychological symptoms, including depression, hugely strong results in depression, emotion regulation, automatic negative cognitions, experiential avoidance, and interpersonal problems. Highly, for those of you who know research, very high Cohen's D, very large effect sizes, larger than 1, and some of them close to 2. And equally effective in enhancing positive functioning, such as increases in self-compassion, in the experience of well-being, and in self-esteem. And as I said, these improvements were maintained over 12 months after the termination of therapy, in the absence of any therapy. and that the maintenance of improvement is observed in all areas of functioning. So these are some of the findings that you can look at. The clinical impact statement, the transdiagnostic efficacy, the maintenance of gains, and the risks and limitations. Okay, so the next round of what is AEDP really starts to get at its essence. So this phrase says AEDP is change-based in its theory and healing-oriented in its therapeutics. And you might very well say, okay, so what's the big deal about that? Isn't that true of all therapies? Isn't every therapy, aiming for change and healing and et cetera, et cetera? Yes, but the difference is this. The theory of AEDP and what we base our clinical findings in and our clinical work in are mechanisms of adaptive change that occur naturally. Most psychotherapies proceed from psychopathology and how the psychopathology comes about, and then the treatment is aimed at reversing the psychopathology. We, in essence, start with a violet plant. We start with how does change and transformational change occur naturally, adaptively, organically, and what are those change mechanisms that are rooted in our brains and bodies? And then we are on the lookout for accessing those very same change mechanisms that are wired into our brains and bodies and nervous systems, and seeking to access them for the benefit of the therapy. So that's what I mean, that we're change-based in our theory and healing-oriented in our therapeutics. And these are some of, again, the more specific, what I've coined this term, transformational studies. These are some of the work, and it's a slide for you to have and study and really sort of do further research in. But all of this work, which is work of the last 20 years, if not even work of the last 10 years, are about all of these aspects that are of what's innate in our organisms, which are mechanisms of transformational change. And this is like Steve Porges's work on the autonomic nervous system, Dan Siegel's work on interpersonal neurobiology, Rachel Yehuda's work, who has done the epigenetics of healing and resilience in Holocaust survivors, and also the children, the intergenerational transmission, not just of trauma, but also of resilience, on and on and on. Really profound work from all of these researchers, which we have been in conversation with. It both informs and supports this kind of healing-oriented, change-based approach that AEDP takes. So this we're going to talk about a lot, and you're going to see a lot, and you're going to see it demonstrated in the clinical videos, that for us, healing and change for the better and transformation is not only a desired outcome. Of course, it is a desired outcome, but it is also, healing is a process that has particular features and particular markers. It is also an experience for the individual. What is the experience that's associated with healing, with change, and change for the better? And completely and crucially important, it's a dispositional tendency. It's a readiness that we're born with that's awaiting facilitating conditions. And of course, how to bring that about and how to facilitate it and how to bring it to the fore in light of traumatic experiences is our question, right? So that it's not just that it's there, but when we're dealing with trauma and relational trauma and wounding, the fertile soil, is either covered by thick layers of concrete or by, tremendous, tremendous brokenness and holes in the concrete. So how we get to that fertile soil is really what the clinical work is about. One, more idea of these big, big ideas that are really sort of like fundamental to the framework, which is that it's a transformational therapy aiming for quantum change. And quantum change is defined as some change which is discontinuous, sudden, can be enduring, simultaneously affecting many areas of functioning at once. And it is in contrast with slow, incremental, imperceptible, developmental change. Very important. And, the gradual developmental, gradual over time change is also a change process that operates in therapy. Absolutely. But our clinical work is focused on the quantum change. Now, I want you to consider something that all of us already believe in quantum change and that kind of transformational change. It is called trauma. In one moment, everything changes. That's really what trauma is. In one moment, everything changes and it simultaneously affects many areas of functioning. For us, we're seeing AEDP, we're aiming for quantum change in the realm of healing. And how we define quantum change, I think we'll talk more about as we go through the day. And you'll also have an opportunity to witness it in the videos that I'm going to share with you. So one, in light of what I've just said about AEDP being a change-based theory and aiming for quantum change and transformational change, one of the things that I want to highlight before we get into the nitty-gritty is that we are always on the lookout for that moment of change for the better, that little violet plant peeking through the concrete. And similarly, we work with that. And we work with the individual's experience of that change and healing. So, before I go to my next slide, I am going to ask you for just initial responses to what I've said so far. Any questions and comments? The one thing that I would ask you is hold your specific comments about specific clinical issues. Well, how do I deal with somebody who's been, who's resistant? We'll deal with that in the second part of the day or a little later. For now, I just want more initial reactions to this fundamental framework that really holds the work. Questions and comments, your reactions to what I've shown. So would love to stop for that.
So let me see. I want to make sure that I understand which types of questions that you want. There are some questions about who AEDP is used for and who it might not be recommended for. Would that be a place to start?
Let's start. I want sort of a little bit more theoretically oriented or global experiences or comments. I'll answer, sure. I'm happy to address that. I wanted to do that a little bit. Let's say who's ADP indicated for. I'll answer that. Yes, that's fine.
Okay, so the specific questions are around, is AEDP effective for neurodivergent folks, especially autism? Um, why is it not recommended for folks with impulse control issues, such as ADHD, that kind of thing?
Okay, so I think that so first of all, I think that we have been getting just a lot of feedback in our ADP community, in our ADP listserv, that it actually is a wonderful, wonderful modality for people with neurodivergent learning and expressive styles, and for people on the autistic spectrum. I think that, when we say that, particularly in the study, so some of the exclusionary criteria in our research were exclusionary criteria in the context of 16-session treatment. There were people who we thought would be able to benefit from the work, but also be able to complete it in 16 sessions. And people who were acutely suicidal, people who were, dealing with addiction issues actively, people with impulse control issues and who were in situations of domestic violence and so on and so forth. These are some of the exclusionary criteria from the research. We did not think that it would be a wise thing to have them in a treatment that had a finite limit, because those are all unpredictable things that might very well, sort of benefit from 16 sessions, but might need a very different kind of intervention. In terms of ADP without a time limit, what I would mostly say, like when we started this, we had some of these exclusionary criteria, but what we have found through the work of people in our community, as well as some of our faculty members, is that ADP has so many different aspects, and that the most fundamental aspect of it, which is about attunement, relationality, and tracking moment to moment and responding to what is happening in the moment between that individual and that therapist in the context of what is being dealt with, that sort of adaptability has actually made it very, very useful with not only folks, on the autistic spectrum, where we might not do the full, all-out emotional processing work, but the relational work and the attunement and the working with the violet through the cracks in the concrete and focusing on moments of change. All these aspects, which are also parts of ADP, I think are very powerful in working with neurodivergent folks. I think they're actually powerful in working with people dealing with addiction and recovering from addiction, even in the early stages of recovery. And we've also had, at least a couple of our faculty members who have applied this work with chronically psychotic patients, right? I wouldn't say that it's the treatment of choice, because that's not, we're saying this is a treatment for people with psychotic disorders. However, we have found that it can be applied. And bottom line, what I want to say to you, even though today we're not really just focused on evaluation and assessment and, these kinds of questions, is that what we do is a dyadic diagnosis. Rather than looking at what is this person's diagnosis, how chronic is it, what is their level of functioning, that the most accurate diagnosis or the most accurate assessment for whether AEDP is applicable to this particular dyad is what we call a dyadic diagnosis. Can this person work with this therapist with this model? And if there's a response to the work, we use the notion of a trial therapy for our initial session. And if the trial therapy is successful, then we're going to give it a shot, even though the person might fall outside of, our more narrowly defined categories, but who it's indicated for, are folks who, really suffer from, the kinds of things that bring people to psychotherapy: depression, anxiety, interpersonal problems, and trauma, both chronic, both complex PTSD and PTSD. And I think like the sweetest spot of AEDP is relational trauma. And most folks who come seeking psychotherapy and counseling and seeking help, whatever else they're dealing with, there's usually some aspect of relational trauma, whether it's front and center or just an aspect of what they're dealing with.
There was a question about the moment of change that you referenced, and so sort of a twofold question. I'm curious if you could say more of what it is that you're looking for in that trial session that says, yes, this seems like a good fit, I'm going to move forward with this. Is it that moment of like, are there moments of change that happen there? And how do you sort of like recognize, notice, and sort of, respond to moments of change throughout?
Okay, that's what my presentation is about, so stay tuned.
Lovely.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to get a little bit more, but again, just hear this as the conceptual framework that holds the clinical work, which is really important. So I've already talked about healing orientation, and I just want to specify what I mean and what we mean by healing from the get-go, which is that much as the potential for neuroplasticity and for positive neuroplasticity is wired into our nervous systems, we're born with it, and we retain that capacity throughout our lives from the cradle to the grave. That innate capacity to respond to facilitative conditions with positive change, that's positive neuroplasticity. That's what we mean healing from the get-go. So a different picture, but same idea as the daisy. And here's this quote: "We assume a healthy core within all people, no matter how much trauma and difficulties and adversities they have suffered and how much of it they have been affected by it. Because the seeds for healing and self-writing are innate and ever-present, AEDP practitioners believe in healing from the get-go, that is, from the very first session and then in every session thereafter. And we're always on the lookout for it. And I'll talk more specifically and clinically about that. Our approach is healing-oriented, also non-pathologizing. You will see what I mean by that, how we understand defenses and protective mechanisms and their consequences as adaptation and best survival efforts under untoward circumstances. So we are wired for self-writing and healing as the potential for positive neuroplasticity operates from the cradle to the grave. Sorry, and we're going to also apply that the potential, and this is going to be a challenge because it's going to sort of challenge for some of you, some of your assumptions, which is that the potential for secure attachment is also there from the get-go, regardless of the attachment trauma that people have suffered. So just hold on to that. We're going to explore it. So John Bowlby said, the human psyche, like human bones, is strongly inclined toward self-healing. The psychotherapist's job, like that of the orthopedic surgeon, is to provide the conditions in which self-healing can best take place. Now, the conditions that we are providing are relational conditions. So that's the dialectic. We're providing relational conditions in which self-healing can take place. This is for different aspects of AEDP. I will let you really sort of like delve more deeply into that. And now I want to cover these sort of like 7 crucial tenets of AEDP, basic aspects. The first one we have very much talked about already, but I want to give it a name, which is, the name is Transformance. And our Transformance is the name that we have given the wired-in motivation for healing and self-writing. It is what allows these little brave plants against all odds to survive and to flourish. So this motivation for self-writing and change and healing, we call Transformance. And we are Transformance detectives. We're always looking for these glimmers of resilience and hope and motivation for change. And when we see them, we work with them experientially. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay. Transformance detection involves focusing in on and affirming transformance glimmers of and these glimmers of resilience, hope, and motivation to heal and self-right that we find in the midst of stress, distress, and psychopathology. That's the important piece to remember. We're here that we will get to the brokenness and the trauma and the psychopathology and, the protective efforts to foster survival that are no longer useful. We'll get to that. That is really the work that we're doing. But to begin with, transformance detection. We actually now have empirical evidence of healing from the get-go. This study by DeCorsia et al., showed evidence of healing in the initial sessions of AEDP sessions and how that was used in a way that related positively to outcome 16 sessions later. Okay, somebody asked about, what about this moment of change, right? What do we do? So we privilege the emergence of the new and the good. I'm going to show you the images first, and then I'm going to go back to talking about it first, right? Change and their fluctuations that really happen moment to moment all the time. But the moments that we're focusing on are of 2 sorts. One is this moment. What happened between here and here? How does it feel to be here? What was the process? What was his experience of whatever it took to get him from here to here? What was that like in his body? What does it feel to have started here and be here? That's one of the ways that we work with a moment of change for the better. We also celebrate it, we name it, we affirm it, we explore it, and we deal with the defenses against it, right? The other moment, the other emergence that we also focus on is the moment of emergent affect. Somebody is really talking, and you start to see the emergence of, let's say, the affect of anger, or the emergence of sadness, or the emergence of tenderness. When we see these moments, and again, and there's a shift from what is unfolding, and then this starts to rise. We shift background and foreground, and we put the moment of change, be it a moment of affect or a moment of change for the better, we put it in the foreground. So this is how we work with it experientially, and you will see it in my videotape. So we notice and seize that moment of change for the better, that moment of healing, or an emergent and new and good experience, and we make that the focus of the experiential work. We highlight and stay with what's new and good and different, especially when they occur side by side with the same old, and we focus on the experience. So I'll give you an example. So for example, let's say somebody you've been working with for a while sort of like comes in and says, I had a very difficult visit when I went to see my family. It was incredibly stressful. However, I have to say that this time, all those little critical digs from my mother didn't really get to me. I was able to just sort of stay connected. But she said this, and my sister did that, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really important to deal with how they felt about all the other stuff that happened, because this person says, it starts out by saying it was difficult and stressful. And we're definitely going to get to that. But in the middle of this same old, there's one little glimmer. This time, my mother's digs didn't get to me. Oh, well, go to what happened with the criticism or all the other stuff that you want to tell me about. We'll go to that in a moment. But can we just stay with, wow, what was it like to have her throw those little digs? And for you to stay centered, to sort of stay focused on your experience. Wow. So number one, therapist delight. Wow, that's amazing. Number two, affirming it. That's great. Number three, focusing on it. Taking it out of the story and saying, we'll get to the other stuff in a moment. Can we focus on that moment? And four, wow, what was it like? What did it feel like to have her do the same old, but for you to sort of be able to just hold your center? What did that feel like in your body? What is it like now to just let yourself see that you were able to do that? What is it like to share it with me, right? So this is what I mean. We focus, we celebrate, we affirm, and then the experiential work. What's it like in your body? What's it like to consider? What's it like to share it with me? And that begins an exploration. So now, after we've done that by focusing on the emergence of this moment, when we've done that, when we go to all the stuff that was stressful and difficult, because the patient is not even noticing, this is like a little throwaway line. Yeah, I noticed my mom didn't really get to me so much this time, and their focus is on the but A and B and C and D. All of a sudden we've shifted the focus. Wow, you were able to maintain center and mindfulness. How'd you do that? You were successful. So when we go to the other stuff, we're going with a much more resourced person with a shifted sense of their own self as we go to explore the difficulties. And so that's, these moments of change for the better, these moments of emergence of something good in the midst of the same old, right? Now, how we work with emergent affect, we'll talk about a lot. That's going to be a later and focused part of my presentation. So that's the second. So the first is transformance, detection. The second is emergence, right? We privilege and focus on the moment of change, and then experientially work with it. However, what we need for transformance and emergence to come to the fore is safety. And in AEDP, we seek to create safety through undoing aloneness. And now we start to get into really what the focus of today's workshop is: the relational aspects of the experiential work, and I want to say the relational dyadic aspects. So our third core tenet, our third core principle is undoing aloneness. And as you might recognize, this is a profound, this is an image from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. And it's Adam reaching to the hand of God. So we are definitely wired to connect. That's in our neurobiology, and the being wired to connect is both to seek connection and to give connection, right? The baby's needing it, and the mother or the caregiver is wired to respond to the baby's need and wish and desire with her own responsiveness and her own needs to provide attachment. So our aim in AEDP is to construct a patient-therapist relationship which is characterized, if possible, or as much as possible from the get-go, by secure attachment, one where the patient never feels alone with overwhelming experience. The therapeutic relationship aims to be the secure base from which fear, shame, and distress can be dyadically regulated together, and from which the experiential explorations of deep and painful traumatic emotional experiences can be risked. Experiential work with receptive experiences of attachment is key, and we'll talk about that soon. So aspects of undoing aloneness: co-constructing safety. Again, it takes two to tango. Both, it's not one recipient, one giver and one recipient. It's a feedback loop. Empathy, this animal is distressed and this animal is providing care. And also dyadic affect regulation. One animal is having the difficult feelings and the other animal is helping them deal with it by sharing in it and helping them regulate. You've seen the attunement. However, before talking more about undoing aloneness, I want to sort of talk to you about aloneness, right? Somebody said solitude in response to my first picture. And I want to differentiate here between solitude, or the kind of nurturing privacy or aloneness, or solitude that can be nurturing and can be calming and soothing to the nervous system, between that kind of aloneness and what we're talking about here, which is unwilled and unwanted aloneness. Okay, and this is a very famous sculpture of aloneness. It's at Burning Man, and it turns out that it's by a Ukrainian artist. And right, it shows these two people in isolation, really yearning for connection, but even though they're back to back, feeling so completely alone, right? Because aloneness is not just physical aloneness. So this is the part that I want you to consider, that the experience of aloneness and unwilled and unwanted aloneness of that is foundational to modern developmental relational theory. It is the empirical basis of all attachment research and also of the still face paradigm. Both of them rest on 2 minutes of aloneness. Two minutes. What do I mean by that? All of attachment research on styles, on security, insecurity, disorganization, they have one basic paradigm. The child and the caregiver come into the room, they're toys, they're having a nice time, they're playing at an agreed upon signal. The caregiver leaves the room, and the baby, the child, is alone for 2 minutes. They're protesting, they're trying to deal with it. 2 minutes later, the caregiver comes back, and all of attachment research on attachment patterns that's done in the lab, that's experimental, all of it is based on the reunion behavior after 2 minutes of aloneness. Really, really sit and consider that profound fact. All of attachment research is based on 2 minutes of aloneness and had the reaction to the reunion after that. Most of you know Etronic's brilliant still face paradigm. So it starts with a much younger child. You know, these are babies. They can't walk and they can't talk, but there's a tremendous amount of communication going on between the baby and the mother. And once again, at an agreed upon this lovely connection, and they're going back and forth non-verbally, and everybody's really happy. At an agreed upon signal, a little ding from the experimenter, the mother goes still face. She doesn't leave the room. The baby's not alone physically, but mom or caregiver is still faced. And if you haven't seen these videos, I urge you to go on YouTube. There are a bunch of them, and see these 2 minutes of still face. They are torture to watch. They're absolutely torture to watch. The babies fall apart. They get angry. They try to get away. They developmentally start to regress. They drool. They lose facial tone. 2 minutes of still face. Right? Protest. And this is what happens when there's no repair, you know, and it goes on and on and on like that. After 2 minutes, the caregiver, the parent, you know, comes back into contact, and then they have the job of repairing and reestablishing connection. And so when Etronic devised this paradigm, he did it to study maternal depression in, you know, normal dyads. So if you see this level of distress and protest in response, and also falling apart, the babies start to really fall apart. You see them, as I said, drooling and, you know, slumping down in the baby seat. If these 2 minutes of aloneness that still face have this kind of a devastating consequence, you can imagine when we're faced with actual unwilled and unwanted aloneness, when we're faced with maternal depression, when we're faced with aloneness, which lasts a lot longer than the 2 minutes in these experimental conditions. This is really what we're talking about. And it's the experience of aloneness, whether it's in isolation or aloneness unwilled and unwanted deep aloneness in the presence of somebody. So this really leads us to our definition, AEDP's definition, one sentence definition of psychopathology, which is, it's simple and informs the treatment, but I think is really profound and goes to the essence of what this work is about. Psychopathology is that which results from the individual's unwilled and unwanted aloneness in the face of overwhelming emotion. Period. That's it. Right? It's the individual's own experience of aloneness in the face of whatever feels too painful, too much, too strong, too intense, too scary for them. So this in turn leads us to, again, simple but profound definition of what the clinical implications for AEDP work are of this, which is we seek to undo the patient's aloneness so that together we co-create safety so that we can engage in the dyadic affect regulation of emotion so that emotion can be experientially processed towards completion and towards a corrective emotional experience. Right? And then we have a whole clinical methodology to take that corrective emotional experience and amplify it and expand it. We call it metaprocessing, and that's our 7th process that we're going to look at. So for us in AEDP, undoing aloneness is both a stance and a practice, a stance of how we approach the patient in just how we engage. We're not neutral, right? And this goes against so much of what so many of us have learned, or is true of other models, but is taught in graduate school. So it involves breaking a number of taboos. We're deliberately affirmative, explicit offers of undoing aloneness, emotional engagement. You cannot do attachment work with a neutral face. You can't. In essence, that's the still face. It's counterindicated. It's embodied, and we have a relationally reparative stance. We want to engage and interact in such a way that really repairs the relational difficulties that they have suffered. We have dyadic mindfulness, right? Mindfulness of the patient, of ourselves, of the dyad that we promote in both them and us. Affirmative advocacy for our clients and their knowing and their attempts on their own attempts on behalf of their own healing, and a lot of emotional and actual humility, a lot of permission asking, a lot of seeking collaboration, a lot of really attending and affirming and responding to the will of the patient and their choices, what they choose to do. And asking also, like asking, just owning lapses, owning not knowing, asking for feedback, the whole thing. Okay. The 4th aspect, the experiential method, which is just runs through everything that we do. Facilitating bodily-based experience. This is a picture here of the insula, this tiny little part of our brains, that mediates and regulates interoception and bodily experience. This is a book devoted to the insula. How do you feel? Okay. So dropping down. So different aspects of the experiential method. One is moment-to-moment tracking. The subtle changes from here to here to here, the process by which we get from here to here. We track it in the patient, we track it in ourselves, we track it in the dyad, and we notice it, and occasionally we choose, right, to focus on a particular moment. That's what we had talked about in terms of moment of change. What does facilitating access to bodily-based experience in its felt sense? And I'm sure that many of you have done work in some of the more somatically body-focused trauma models, so you probably know a lot about that. But it involves bottom-up processing, shifting the focus away from in-the-head cognition, where people have lots of ideas and lots of thoughts and lots of narrative, and shifting it towards in the moment, in the body, sensing and feeling through somatic interventions that explore the somatic bodily-based correlates of experience. Encouraging patients to slow down. Ideas are quick, and people can talk about a mile a minute and a million ideas. Emotions are slow. Sensations are slow. We got to slow down, have a different tone, attend to the body to encourage embodiment and somatic experiencing. We help patients get a felt sense of their experience. Somebody comes in and says, I'm so angry. Okay. What's that like in your body? What are you aware of? What are you aware of in your muscles? What in your body tells you that you're angry? What's that like? Felt sense of the experience. And it's also when we discover when people say, I'm so angry, but they have zero access to it. That's a different kind of work that we have to do with them, as opposed to launch into a whole exploration of their anger when they're not in touch with it. We want to engage procedural rather than narrative memory, maintain an experiential focus, stay with what's inside. So just yesterday, I was dealing with a patient. We were doing some work with his experience he's a man in his 50s who's having panic around issues of abandonment as he and his wife are negotiating a separation. And he really is having these experiences of panic at being abandoned that we have been able to trace back to what happened when he was 11 years old, for a long period of time, when his mother was heavily drinking and he, as the youngest, was alone at home with her. Okay, so we've located the panic as at least in part belonging to the 11-year-old. And I'm trying to work with him to do some work with the 11-year-old, and he has all of these ideas that, it's very helpful to know that the panic comes from the 11-year-old and it's not congruent with my current and all of this stuff. But he has this belief, that it happened and there's nothing to do about that. And it had such devastating, damaging consequences, right. So he has all of these ideas, and I just very gradually work with him to try to do a portrayal, what we call a portrayal of imagining, the 11-year-old, just saying to his mother, how much he's hurt by it. And also in the context of that, what comes up is that when he was 16, he confronted his mother and he said, this cannot go on. This has to stop. And his mother stopped drinking, right? His mother went to 12-step and really stopped drinking. And he had never processed the impact of the fact that he asked and she responded. So we're working with that. And again, he keeps no, that's good. And that was very brave of her, but the damage is done. And as I am working with his body and saying, okay, so you told her This cannot continue. And she heard you. What do you feel? He continues to have his thoughts, but he takes a deep sigh. His shoulders relax. And I draw his attention to that and says, so again, it's so even if it's only 5% or 2% of your experience, what is it like to feel heard? And finally, he's able to see that his body reacted before his mind and to say, yeah, I feel softness and I feel a relaxation in my body, and then we had to do work to get his cognitions to sort of catch up with this experience. But that's, part of what I mean by an experiential focus and focusing on procedural or somatic experience rather than narrative memory. In the narrative memory, it's fixed. It was damaging. It sucked. It was no good. It really, really hurt me. And it was back then. And what can you do about it? Very different experience in the somatic experiential realm. Continuing with our theme, this experiential work is with everything in AEDP. Not only do we work, I don't even have emotions here. Oh, I do, right. We work with the experience of emotion and the sensations that occur in the body as we're processing trauma. We do this like so many other models do, experiential models of working with trauma and with working with the body and working with emotion, right? Gestalt and Les Greenberg's EFT and somatic experience and sensory motor psychotherapy. All these different approaches that work with emotion and sensation. But in addition, we also work with the experience of attachment. We also work with the experience of, as we've talked about, the moment of change, particularly change for the better, and with experiences of receptivity, we're going to talk about a lot more. But when something is offered, like empathy is offered, or care is offered, or sympathy or delight on your behalf, what is it like to receive it? Right? Because if we have this whole attachment oriented stance and we're about sort of expressing care and so on and so forth, or empathy, if I express empathy, the only way that it's effective is if the patient receives it. If the patient doesn't receive it, if there are blocks or defenses against it, we want to know that. Or if I'm misattuned and I think I'm being empathic, but the person doesn't feel empathy, we need to know that. But if they're experiencing our empathy, if they feel understood, if they feel seen, if they feel cared about, what's the experience of feeling seen? What's the experience of feeling cared about? Those are receptive experiences. For my patient, he had to register that his mother received, that for 5 years, all he had been, saying and doing had no impact. But in that one moment, when he seriously approached her and said, this has to stop, this is no good, she heard him. He needed to process that she heard him, and he needed to process, what is it like that you were heard? HEARD. That's a receptive experience. What's it like that you were heard? We also work with experiences of healing, experiences of transformation, just like any other experience, and once he experienced that change in his body, I worked with that. What is it like to notice your relaxation? Be with it. What's that like? Right? The experience of change, change from the better, from his hardness to the deep exhale, the dropping of his shoulders, and his relaxation. Okay, before I go to this next piece, which is a major piece, I am going to actually stop my share. And Anna, I want to take some questions, but I also just want to ask the people who are present, if they would share some reactions, not just questions, but some reactions, right? We're talking about receptivity. How is what I'm presenting landing? If I were seeing your faces, I could see that. Since I don't, help me out and let me know how this is landing. So I'll take questions, comments.
Sure. So I'll throw out a question while I pull up. There were some reactions throughout, and so I just want to grab those. But in the meantime, we'll go to some questions. You talked about the validation process a bit, and there was a question about how important the use of validation in the process is, and if validating of the painful experiences in any way, the question was, is it conducive to the healing process?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's very important, right? It's also very important as we focus on the transformance, or we focus on the, brave little violet sort of peeking through the cracks, that the patient doesn't feel that we're missing their trauma and their suffering, right? And to validate and empathize with how difficult it was and how overwhelming or painful or absolutely crucial. And again, much as I'm focusing sort of like how we work with the healing aspects, right? Because I want to focus on what makes AEDP different. We're doing that, and we will totally engage and validate their suffering and work to transform that. With my patient yesterday, he suffered enormously, and it did affect him, and it did damage him those years and years and years when he, as a little boy, as a young boy, was alone with his mother, who was heavily drinking. That was devastating. And that's really important to validate and explore its consequences for him, and really all sorts of things. And then, given that he at 56 or however old he is still feeling panic, that is the panic of the 11-year-old, we want to heal it. That 11-year-old has to heal, because he's no longer 11. He's no longer with his mother who's drinking, right? So that's when we lean into an imaginary dialogue, or playing back a dialogue that actually took place, right? Because he did confront her in actuality, and she did in actuality. That led to her stopping drinking, except that he had never processed that part of it. That his request, that his from the heart, this has to stop, landed, and she got it. And that had to be processed too.
There was a few responses here about the strengths-based perspective of AEDP, the empirical research, and really liking that, and also about the focus on the innate ability of clients to heal, and the benefits of sharing that with them and really focusing on that. So that came through several times.
Great. Great. When I teach the immersion course, we actually spend a fair amount of time on these kind of biological basis of this innate drive to heal, and some of the developmental research sort of documenting this sort of like self-righting tendency under facilitating conditions. But really, just as a sort of like way of quickly summarizing all of the research on the conditions that are facilitating of positive neuroplasticity and the capacity of people to respond neuroplastically to facilitative conditions is really just part and parcel of that. So for instance, when people do mindfulness-based stress reduction meditation, there are profound changes in the brain, in the face of trauma, in the face of tension, in the face of illness, in the face of all of this, just by the capacity to develop a mindfulness practice. So, similarly, Steve Porges's work on the polyvagal theory and the autonomic nervous system, you change from a harsh tone to a warm tone. You engage a different part of the autonomic nervous system. You give somebody who's stressed, the breaking bread, chewing and eating and drinking, and particularly sharing bread together. Just by that, you bring up the social engagement system. You play particular kinds of music to the autonomic nervous system. You have a shift in minutes from the fight-flight sympathetic arousal, or from the, dorsal vagal shutdown to the social engagement system. These are all transformations that occur by changing conditions, and they're profound transformation. And there's like endless amount of research really supporting that. And that's why I sort of put that DeCorsia et al. Article that, it's something that we teach and it's something that we do, but it's very nice to also have the empirical validation, that in fact those kinds of healing from the get-go experiences occur in session 1 from the get-go, and that they're related to the, subsequent outcome of the therapy.
So we're at time for break.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and take a break and just ask everyone to hop back on at 1/4 of the hour. So in about 14 minutes.
Sounds